We think of ourselves as this invincible, invulnerable colossus that bestrides the world. We're not. And we are failing to invest where we need to here at home. We are not investing in high-end manufacturing. We're not investing in energy. We're not investing in the agricultural sector. These are our great strengths that we should capitalize on. We're not doing it. And instead of fearing China, what we should do is limit our exposure where we think that they present a threat to us economically, but stop this ridiculous nonsense of going to war yet again 6,000 miles from the United States over an obscure island called Taiwan. That's silly. It's nonsensical. Just as fighting the Russians in Ukraine is nonsensical for us. It's irrelevant. It's crazy. I spent 28 years in the regular Army after graduating from West Point. I left the Army at the end of 2004. I then began in a number of different jobs working with or inside the defense industries, either as a consultant or an advisor. And then ultimately started becoming a routine commentator on television and radio about military affairs, and finally ended up as the senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump in his last months as president.
So when this whole Ukraine thing started, what was your first response?
Well, I had been somewhat on the periphery of the Ukrainian crisis, if you will. I had been asked to look at Ukraine back in 2014 in the aftermath of the so-called Maidan revolution, which installed this very right-wing government that is hostile to Russia, largely conceived and executed by the United States and the CIA. Over time, the Ukrainian government in Kiev began actively oppressing the Russian-speaking population. Russians inside Ukraine, even though they were Ukrainian citizens, effectively became second-class citizens. And so conflict was just a question of when, no longer if. Ukraine has an interesting history. The Ukraina, the word itself, means on the periphery or on the margin or on the edge, depending upon how you want to translate it. And the people that live on the edge of what was called Russia were always different from the Russians themselves. And Ukraine developed a strong sense of identity, particularly in the 20th century. People argued that it was always there. There was always a Ukrainian people. But I don't think the sense of nationhood was really there until the aftermath of World War I. And there was a serious attempt to build a nation when the Imperial German and Austrian forces pulled out. That failed, and Ukraine was ultimately Bolshevized, like the rest of the Tsarist Empire. Unfortunately, Lenin, who was a student of history, understood Tsarist Russia very well, and he altered borders to ensure that there were always minorities within the various provinces or oblasts, whatever you want to call them, who would prevent any large concentration of force that could be aimed at the center. In other words, let's include Russians, Tartars, and others inside Ukraine who are not Ukrainian to ensure there is no ethnically pure Ukraine that emerges that could present a threat to unity in the Soviet Union.
And this was out of response to the farmers, the kulaks,
Well, that actually comes later. That's under Stalin, and Stalin sets out to utterly destroy and annihilate tens of millions of people, not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia, who were so-called independent farmers. That was defined loosely as someone who has a plot of land and may own a cow. In other words, that was part of the class warfare gambit, pitting people against each other. But it also created an opportunity for people to plunder Ukraine, murder people, plunder their belongings, enrich your friends who are thugs who are supporting you in Moscow. We think that somewhere between 7, 8, 9, 10 million Ukrainians were killed, probably 1 or 2 million Russians that just happened to be in the way as well. That was not the first time that there was a famine that was orchestrated to murder people. That had already happened under Trotsky and Lenin. Stalin perfected it, raised it to a high art. We don't know how many millions of people died between the time the Bolshevik Revolution occurred and the Second World War breaks out, but certainly somewhere north of 20 million dead. It was a horrible period, and the Ukrainians, of course, never forgot it. This orchestrated famine then becomes an excuse to effectively destroy the population in the attempt to Sovietize it, to transform it into what the Bolsheviks called the Soviet man. Terrible crimes were committed, whole families were annihilated, and this, of course, laid the groundwork later on for the Holocaust. The NKVD that was responsible for this murdered large numbers of Ukrainians, and ultimately the Ukrainians then respond with the arrival of the Germans in World War II to a liberation and take out their hatred and anger and antagonism on everyone in sight. I mean, this is hard to characterize today because we don't understand what it's like if you are the only surviving member of a family of, say, 11 or 12 that included grandparents, and that your land that you'd lived on for hundreds of years was taken from you along with all of your belongings so that you literally have nothing left. You ultimately learn to hate Moscow, hate the center, and you're willing to do anything to destroy them. And anyone who comes along who promises to destroy them is your friend. That's effectively what happened in Ukraine. People in the West know almost nothing about Eastern Europe. If you go to the Versailles Treaty discussions, the level of ignorance about Eastern Europe, about Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarusia, just astounding. Or a place like Moldova, which used to be called Bessarabia, no understanding at all of what existed there, no understanding of the people, the complexity of the history. And that resulted in numbers of bad decisions that produced the Versailles Treaty Organization. So the bottom line is I don't fault people in the West for not paying enough attention. It was easier to look at what was happening in Germany because the Germans were open about it. You could walk the streets and see what was happening, and there were still plenty of Germans willing to talk to you. That wasn't the case in the Soviet Union, where there was absolute terror, absolute control by the NKVD that ensured Stalin knew everything and everyone else knew nothing. Well, in January, I was asked whether or not the Russians would go in. And I was one of the few people in Washington that said absolutely they will go in because they were under severe threat. Have to remember that after 2014, the Ukrainians began the process of attacking the so-called two breakaway republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, in the east, which were entirely Russian-speaking. And they killed roughly 14,000 people between 2014 and 2021. And that was one of the reasons that we had the Minsk Accords, because Putin, who was trying to avoid a war, went to the Western powers and said, look, we've got to have some sort of solution in Ukraine which provides for the welfare, care, and security of the Russians living on Ukrainian soil. No one was particularly interested in listening, but he persuaded Merkel and Macron to sign up for these Minsk Accords, which essentially obligated Ukraine to take measures to ensure that Russians would be treated equally before the law, that they could speak their language, go to school, and so forth as Russians inside Ukraine. It was never taken seriously by the West, and that, of course, is what Chancellor Merkel admitted publicly during the summer, that the entire Minsk Accord process was simply designed to buy time to continue the buildup of the so-called Ukrainian army. And what had been happening since 2014 is a very directed, deliberate effort to build not just an army to defend Ukraine, but to build an army that would attack Russia. The army that emerges from this process that we see fighting in 2022 was a very fine force. It was extremely well trained by NATO standards, standing force of about 450,000 with 200,000 trained reserves. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that by the spring of 2022 that this army would probably be hurled at these two breakaway republics with the goal of forcing them back under Ukrainian rule. And I think Putin decided that since the Minsk Accords were a failure, that he would make one final diplomatic effort, which of course he makes in December and January, to try and persuade us, principally, who are the real backers of the war in Ukraine, to come to the negotiating table and make arrangements that would avoid the war. We demonstrated we were totally disinterested, but I think most people in Washington concluded that the Russian economy wasn't strong enough to support a serious war, and that ultimately the Russians would balk and not go in. I was quite convinced that they would. However, I thought they would go in differently from the way they went. They went in with a relatively small force. And I think the attempt was to do two things. First of all, avoid killing as many people as possible. Secondly, avoid damage to the infrastructure. And then third, to persuade us in the West that he was quite serious about his request for a negotiated settlement. It takes him several months to discover, certainly by June and July, that he has no negotiating partners in the West. And more important, he discovers that we in the United States are willing to bankroll this war against Russia effectively in perpetuity, because our real goal is to displace Putin from power, and that's made very clear in Biden's speech in Warsaw when he visits in March, and ultimately to dismember Russia, to carve it up, get control of its resources, literally erase Russia as a great power. This was never acceptable to Putin, or for that matter, to the Russian nation. And thus they had to make some new decisions. We're not going to be able to fight this war with what we have. We're going to have to build new and bigger and better forces. And since then, the Russians have brought in an additional 400,000 reservists and volunteers. These people are now trained. They've been assimilated into the Russian army, and they are dispersed around Ukraine. The vast majority of these troops have continued to train, and they're sitting in reserve. Now, what they have done is they've rotated some Russian forces forward so they could see the battlefield, see the enemy. Some units have gotten limited exposure, but for the most part, the war in the South has been waged with a reliance on what I would call an ISR strike complex. That is, where you link intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms, manned and unmanned, space-based as well as terrestrial, to strike systems being artillery, mortars, rockets, missiles, and unmanned aircraft, or what we now call drones. All of these have been organized to be very responsive, very short period of time, and destroy concentrations of Ukrainian forces as they try to attack the Russians in defense. This has been enormously successful. And as a result, certainly in November, December, and January, the exchange rate was about 8 Ukrainian dead for every 1 Russian killed. And people in the West don't understand that the difference in striking power is 1 to 10. For every 1 gun that the Ukrainians have, the Russians have 10. Putin had given strict orders: don't kill civilians, don't destroy infrastructure. And then when they realized they didn't have enough forces, they decided to essentially lay siege to places like Melitopol and Mariupol. In Mariupol, they had thousands of Ukrainians eventually surrender, but they killed thousands of Ukrainians. So they learned that it wasn't very sensible to go in building to building, room to room, and try and dig people out. It was easier to essentially cut them off, cut the power, cut the water, and then let time do its work for them. The problem for the Russians is this. We have said that we will not relent, that we are going to fight them until they're destroyed. If you tell the Russians that, the Russians say to themselves, well, this war will only end when we are on the Polish border. That's a terrible situation, frankly, for Ukraine, because we've said we will not negotiate. I don't think Putin expected that this would drag on. I think he really thought that once he showed us in the West that he was serious, and that the Russians would not tolerate this large anti-Russian military establishment in eastern Ukraine, that we would then say, stop, let's negotiate. And of course, he was wrong. His great fear was not just the Ukrainian force in eastern Ukraine, but that over time we would emplace missiles in eastern Ukraine that could reach Russia's nuclear deterrent. And that worried him about his ability then to deter us from using nuclear weapons against Russia in the future.
But how could this operation take so long?
Well, very simple. He had a relatively small regular army, and this small force was simply not large enough to fight a war in a country the size of Texas. Remember, he was initially only interested in a portion of what we would call Texas. It's as though you said, well, the Panhandle and eastern Texas are Russian. The rest of it's Ukrainian. I want to ensure the Russian citizens in the Panhandle and in eastern Texas have equal rights before the law. They're not oppressed. They're not being brutalized. They're not being punished for being Russians. That was his goal. And then to find some sort of solution for the 2 republics, Luhansk and Donetsk, and to extract from the Ukrainians the understanding that Crimea was not up for discussion. It was legitimately Russian and had been for hundreds of years. And he hoped then that he could make Ukraine neutral as a multinational, multicultural state, which is rather interesting because we have all of these people currently waging war against him who ostensibly here are insisting on multinationalism and multiculturalism, but they want to destroy Russia when Russia was only interested in ensuring equal rights for their own citizens and neutrality for Ukraine. We insisted, no, Ukraine has to be a member of Nato, and the Russian position had been for decades, no, that touches our borders, it sits on our border. We will accept neutrality. No one's forces there, not yours, not ours, no one's except Ukrainians. And they held up the Austrian state treaty as a good model for Ukraine. And if you haven't looked at the Austrian state treaty, you should, because it has worked very effectively. And he was convinced that this could work in Ukraine. Obviously, he was wrong, and that left him no choice but to do what he's done. There are estimates that the Ukrainians have now fielded 3 armies in a row. The first army was largely destroyed in the spring. Contrary to popular belief, the Ukrainians were not winning relentlessly, which was reported in the news media. The exchange rate with the Russians was never good. Then they built a second army in the summertime that was designed to take the offensive against the Russians. That army was largely destroyed by the fall. And then they built a third army, which is now dying. And much of it has died in Bakhmut, along this 160-mile front in the north of the Donbass, the Donetsk Basin. Bakhmut has become probably one of the largest bloodbaths we've seen, certainly since the Battle of Shanghai in 1937. Now there are estimates of 250,000 dead Ukrainians. That's beyond what I had anticipated. I thought perhaps 200,000. I'm being told no, it's much higher. And it's again because of this overwhelming strike presence on the Russian side. The Russians have the advantage in the air, they have the advantage on the ground. And the Ukrainians can't compensate for that because they simply don't have the wherewithal. Whatever we send to them is being destroyed almost as soon as it shows up at the front. I mean, they've been sending these HIMARS systems, rocket artillery systems over there. The drones that fly over identify them, the artillery strikes them, and they're dead. And this goes on and on and on.
I was just saying all this aid to Ukraine is that a debt to them?
Yeah, absolutely.
They'll be in debt for centuries. So.
Well, they already are, and there's no chance of ever climbing out of it. I mean, this is the great tragedy. Ukraine as a nation has been destroyed. They started out, we think, with maybe 37 million, 37.5. Remember, if you go back into the early 90s, they had almost 90 million people living in Ukraine. When this war started, there were about 37.5 million. There were already 2 million Ukrainians working and living in the West. In other words, everywhere from London to Rome. Now add to that 10 plus million refugees. At least 2 million Ukrainians that were Russians have gone into Russia. Another 9 million Ukrainians plus have gone into Western Europe. And each day more go there. There are almost no women and children left. You do have some men, but we're looking at somewhere between 18 and 22 million people left in Ukraine. And how many of those men are physically fit and capable of fighting? I don't know what that potential is, but it's way below what people estimated initially. And they're now bringing in women and young boys and men over 40, 50, 60 to come in and join units that have been reduced from, say, 500 men down to 100 men. I mean, this is a tragedy unlike anything we've seen since World War II unfolding in front of us. Well, if you look at the people that are running the show in Ukraine right now, they don't seem to be terribly concerned about the destruction of the Ukrainian nation and its state. That's the best that I can say. They're behaving very much like Stalin. And we now know that the losses during the Second World War were not 20 million. They were at least 35 to 39 million. In fact, when I was in Moscow in 2001, I was told that they had counted 39,900,000 and were still counting based on their access to the NKVD archives. This government seems to think in those terms, that they can sacrifice whole generations of men in order to achieve their aims. I don't see any evidence that it's going to work. And the Russians are not going to run out of ammunition. I mean, we've been hearing about the Russians running out of everything. Their factories, their manufacturing centers are turning out equipment and ammunition 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in multiple shifts. The Russians aren't running out of anything, but we are. We've just about run through our own war stocks. Same thing has happened in Europe, where the war stocks were never very high to begin with. So you've got the German defense minister saying we can't send anything else or we won't be able to defend ourselves. And I think you're going to hear that from a lot of European states now.
Is any of this helping Ukraine?
I don't think so. I think the only thing that we've done is played a key role in the destruction of Ukraine. And from the very beginning, I had said to several people, Ukraine is to the Russians essentially what Mexico is to us. If we discovered there was a large army that was built exclusively for the purpose of attacking the United States, and its goal was to, quote unquote, liberate New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and Southern California from the evil white Yankees, I think we would have acted instantly to destroy that army. The Russians have essentially done the same thing. So there was never any chance that the Ukrainians were going to win an all-out war with Russia. And right now, they've got an all-out war with Russia. Well, you've got a nation of over 140 million fighting a country of, 37 million, now down to somewhere between 18 and 22 million. I don't think there's much chance that the nation of 140 million is going to lose. And then finally, the Russians are sitting on territory that has the resources, the manufacturing, the industry, the technical development that represents about 90% of Ukrainian gross national product. They already control it, and they're not going to leave it. So how does prolonging this war help Ukraine? I don't think it does. I don't see any evidence for it. When you deal with the military and the political leadership in Washington, the key questions that are never asked is, first of all, what is the purpose of this operation? And then someone says, well, the purpose is to remove Putin from power. Well, that's a dumb idea because it's not going to happen. If that's your goal, that objective makes no sense. So give me another objective. Well, we want to hurt the Russians. Well, in what regard? Well, we're going to sanction them. Well, we already know that the sanctions have failed. There's no chance of destroying the Russian economy through sanctions. On the contrary, the ruble is now one of the strongest currencies in the world. And the Russian economy has actually thrived because there are plenty of people in the world that want to do business with the Russians because the Russians have an abundance of food and abundance of resources, mineral resources, oil, natural gas. So if that's the case, that's not a reasonable objective. So give us another objective. We never go through that. Well, if you don't ask the first question, what's the purpose, and come up with something reasonable, the second question is, how do you plan to do this? And no one ever sat down, well, we're just going to drop an avalanche of equipment on top of the Ukrainians. We're going to give them our best intelligence. That should be enough. Finally, what do you want it to look like when it's over? Well, we want Russia to be destroyed and Putin to be gone. Well, again, this is absurd. This is nonsensical. What are you talking about? It is crazyville. So you don't have responsible, mature, balanced diplomats and military commanders talking to you. You're talking to people who are worse than amateurs. They're ideologically blinded to reality. Their hatred has unbalanced them. You know, the first question I ask people when they start, well, Russia, once Russia's destroyed, then it's just China. Where are these Russian and Chinese armies mobilizing to invade us? Where are these vast air forces ready to attack us and bomb us? Where are these vast fleets assembling off our shore to invade us and destroy us? This is just nonsensical. It's crazy. We are still fortunate in that we do live between two major oceans. We have an enormous strategic advantage over everyone. We've squandered it by making enemies where really, frankly, there were none. And that's very true for Russia. Russia had actually cooperated with us very closely, especially after 2001. And their help in Afghanistan to us in the beginning was absolutely essential. If we hadn't had their intelligence and their support with the Northern Alliance, we could not have gone into that country and stayed for any length of time. The notion that Russia was this unconditionally hostile enemy was never true. I think it is now, and I think it will be decades before the Russians really recover from their experience with us. So, at this stage, it's hard to see anything good happening for us. I don't think NATO is going to survive this experience. I think the Europeans are going to come out of this with new governments. I don't know if they'll happen next week or in 6 months, but I think governments are going to change in Europe. You're going to see new leaders emerge, and their attitude is going to be, why should we follow these Americans? All the things that we don't like about the Chinese, we can deal with here at home. If you don't want the Chinese to steal your intellectual property, then don't allow them into your laboratories, your corporate labs, your university labs, your research and development. Why let them in? Why let them study in our universities if you're that concerned about the Chinese? Why not defend your border? You're letting thousands of Chinese walk into our country illegally right now. We don't even know where they went. We don't know where they're going. We don't know what they're here to do. That doesn't seem to bother anybody. But those things should be addressed here at home first. And then you need a trade policy. And the trade policy is very simple. We'll do business with China if it's in our interest to do so. If it's not in our interest to do so, we shouldn't do business with them. It's a very simple prospect. And we got to get control of this very corrupt elite in this country. The people that shipped our manufacturing base to China are the wealthy ruling classes of this country. They began that process while Reagan was in office. And it simply snowballed in the 90s under Clinton. Lots of people got rich from shipping out those factories, those manufacturing centers. What difference did it make to us whether Ukraine was neutral or not? None. We should have made it neutral. When Eisenhower was president, he ultimately welcomed Austria's neutrality because he argued that we don't have the resources to defend all these countries. The more neutral states we create, the easier the military burden is on us. Well, that was in the 1950s when we were certainly stronger conventionally than we are today. And if you look at the balance of power between the various states, we're dealing with a continental power in Russia. We're primarily a maritime and aerospace power. Our strength is really at sea and in the air. We are only a land power in the Western Hemisphere. So the notion that somehow or another we're going to take on and defeat a continental power is ludicrous nonsense. And we are failing to invest where we need to here at home. We are not investing in high-end manufacturing. We're not investing in energy. We're not investing in the agricultural sector. These are our great strengths that we should capitalize on. We're not doing it. And instead of fearing China, what we should do is limit our exposure where we think that they present a threat to us economically. Remember, China abandoned communism in the early 1990s. That's what people don't seem to understand. We keep saying the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party. I challenge anybody to find a communist in China. These people are capitalists. They understand how to make money. And what China wants to do is wants to transform itself into some facsimile of Singapore. By the way, so do the Japanese and the Koreans. They're all very enamored of the Singaporean model. Well, that's reprehensible to us because we'd say Singapore is a fascist state, which of course it is. It's a partnership between the corporations and the government that goes far beyond anything we imagine. And then the rules and laws of those areas are strictly enforced by the government, and the government owns virtually all of the property. We don't understand Asia. We don't understand the people in Asia. We absolutely do not understand the Chinese and what they want. They do not want to live in a liberal democracy as we imagine it. They don't want to elect a president from a multi-party system. Xi is effectively the modern equivalent of the Chinese emperor. And they're very happy with that because they see that as absolutely essential to their security. And what are the three things that the Asians expect from their government? They expect security from external attack. And that was something the Chinese emperors failed miserably to do in the last 200 years of Chinese imperial rule. They expect the people to be fed, something else that the emperors failed to do at the end of their dynasty or dynastic succession. And three, they expect the population to be sheltered. Now, if you look at those three things, the Chinese leadership today has done those things very well. If you compare China to, say, India, There is none of the crippling poverty, the horrific poverty that you see on the streets in India does not exist in China. And China has 1.4 billion people. Those three things are what they want. We in the United States should be demanding something similar from our own government. Security, number one, for our country. And that has been treated with complete contempt, if not total disinterest. If they were really interested in protecting us, we wouldn't have this wave of criminality sweeping across the country. We wouldn't have these open borders. How many repeat criminals do we routinely apprehend that have been released for all sorts of terrible crimes, who've been deported and keep coming back? What sort of nonsense is this? Why do we tolerate these things? We have a government that seems to be suicidal here at home and suicidal overseas. They're picking enemies that we cannot take on and defeat, nor should we try, and we don't have to. And at the same time, they're doing things here at home that are destructive to our society. It's hard to imagine a worse set of circumstances. And the question is not so much, what do we do about the government? What do we do about the American people? Who are the Americans? Where are they? What are they doing? When are they standing up and saying, no more? We will not tolerate this any longer. It hasn't happened because here, the standard of living is still too high. Life is still too easy. I think the current financial and economic crisis is about to change that. And so perhaps that will awaken the American people to their responsibilities to themselves. And maybe then we'll get a different government that wants to protect us, that wants